You can just relax and we're just going to talk and be very casual, so just act like it's not even on. Hello, today is November 29th, 1994, and my name is Dan Cruz, and I am a volunteer with the Illinois Historical Society, which is cooperating with a statewide effort to collect oral histories from Illinois citizens that participated in the momentous events surrounding World War II. We are in the home of Raymond Miller and your address, Raymond?
1012 Archer Avenue, Marshall.
And Raymond served in a branch of the United States Armed Forces during World War II, and we are interviewing him about his experiences in that war. Raymond, please start off our little conversation tonight by introducing yourself to me, please.
I'm Raymond Miller of 1012 Archer Avenue. I served with the 87th Infantry Division in ETO.
Could you give me the place and date of your birth, Raymond?
Marshall, October the 25th, 1921.
We would also like to have the names of each of your parents.
My father's name was Francis W. Miller, and my mother's maiden name was Elizabeth Clapp.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a brother that was in the Korean conflict, and he's dead now, but I have a sister, Charlene Kuhn, Fred Kuhn's wife, lives out by Livingston.
Are there any details about your parents or your family that you would like to give to me, which we could record on this tape?
Well, Dad was in the 91st Division in World War I, and the first furlough I had, he could get in his uniform, and he came out, and we had a picture taken together.
Huh. What type of work did your dad do?
He was farmer.
Farmer here in Marshall?
Yeah, Clarksville.
Raymond, what was it like for you before the war, specifically during 1941?
Looking for work, and went to Salem, Illinois, and thought of getting the oil fields, and didn't have a chauffeur's license, so I couldn't take a job that was offered to me, and I came back and started to work for Bob Flowers and Ernest Kyle and the John Deere and Pontiac garage.
What thoughts did you have about the war before the United States became directly in the conflict?
Well, Mr. Holler was a teacher that I went to high school to, and he kept us pretty well up to date to what was going on in Europe. And we knew, and he told us so, that all of us boys in that class would eventually be drafted or enlist and be in it. We would be in it. And he was absolutely right.
Well, what year did you graduate high school?
1940.
40. Did you hear the December 7th, 1941 radio announcement about the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese?
No, I didn't. Dean Martin and I were messing around down at Earl Sumption's old filling station down by the old railroad on East Archer, and we came back up to town after he got off work. He was working there, and somebody told us on the street.
Well, what was your reaction when you heard about the attack?
We didn't have much to say. We remembered Mr. Holler's predictions, and we just kind of looked at each other and wondered when it would happen for us.
Well, had you formed any prior opinion or developed any feeling about what had been taking place either in Europe or Asia at this time?
Well, my dad had mentioned a few times that things looked pretty bleak, similar to when World War II started or before he went to the Army. And of course, he told my brother and I several things about the Army life. And I was pretty well prepared to go when I went.
Do you recall reading newspaper accounts of German aggression in Europe or anything like that?
Mr. Holler covered all that in the class. Some days we'd never open our textbook. It was come out of the papers.
What did he teach at Marshall High School?
He was a history teacher.
Did you have any knowledge of Hitler's speeches or ideas or actions or this type of thing?
Well, I couldn't understand what he was saying, but I did listen to some of his carrying on, and sounded like a crazy man to me.
Well, what events led to your entry into the military service? Were you already in the service or drafted, or did you volunteer?
I was drafted
In what year was this?
1943.
Do you remember the date by any chance?
It was in January, but I don't know what exact date. I'd have to look it up.
Well,
29th, I believe.
Well, when and where were you inducted into the military?
We left Marshall at about midnight and caught the train down here and rode into Chicago and went to Fort Sheridan.
Fort Sheridan. And do you have any special memories of the event of being inducted?
Yeah, the physical examination for one thing.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, here we were all running around with no clothes on, and it was all men, and you know, back in those days you didn't do that.
How old were you when you were inducted into the Army?
21.
21. And what happened after you were inducted?
We were shipped down to Camp Maxey at Paris, Texas for basic training. And after that was over, it was about 15 weeks altogether. We got military police training as well as some infantry, and then they took me down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Army Specialized Training Program. And I was there for that summer, and of course, like a lot of the rest of them, we couldn't keep up with the studies because we got a year's college in 3 months, and we left there in September and went to Fort Custer, Michigan for a replacement in whatever they wanted us in, and I happened to be an MP, so that's what I went out of Fort Custer to Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia, or Hampton Roads Port of Embarkation at Newport News. And I was there somewhere around 16, 17 months, and then I was picked to leave there and go to Camp Livingston, Louisiana for 8 weeks of advanced infantry. Left there and went to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I had got all new equipment and clothes. And from there went up to Camp Miles Standish at Boston and boarded a converted luxury liner called the USS West Point.
And that's what took you overseas.
That took us over to Glasgow, Scotland.
Well, what did you think of your training, as you were at these different military installations, taking this training? What was your thoughts about that?
Well, I watched some of them, and some of them didn't care whether they learned anything or not. And I figured that from what my dad had told me, I better learn all I could learn. So I made PFC in basic, and of course when I went to school at Baton Rouge, I lost it, along with a lot of others that had more rate than I had, and I still wanted to do the best I could.
What type of weapons were you trained to use in the military?
We had instruction on the rifles, 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, mortars, and bazookas, and just offhand I think that hand grenades, stuff like that. Anything the infantry would use.
Now, do you have any special memories of anything special that happened there while you were, or any of the places you were taking your basic training? Anything that stands out?
Yeah, I can tell you a story about in basic training. There was a boy in our outfit that he'd been in an outfit before we got there, and he'd had appendicitis and was went on. He was in the hospital, and he had to come into our outfit to finish up his training. He'd missed a bunch. So we were pulling fire guard, and we weren't allowed ammunition, but we had to carry our rifles and do it in a military manner. And we had officers living off the base, but they had their quarters in base, and we had to guard those at night. And during the hours of challenging, we were supposed to challenge them. And this one officer, I think he was a major, he'd come in about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he wouldn't pay attention to the challenges. He just kept walking. So this one boy that had a little more training than we had, he said, "Let me volunteer for that post the next time." So when he was on there, here come this officer going down to his barracks, and he hollered, "Halt!" And he didn't halt, and he hollered, 2 more times and worked the bolt on his rifle, and that man froze. And he put him all through the procedures of advance and be recognized and show his identification and back off away from him and all that stuff. And when he knew what he was doing, this guard did, he told him he could take his stuff and go on. And the officer said, "I got one question. Do you have ammunition?" And he said, "You'll never know, sir." And the next day we had a complete inspection of our company barracks and everything, looking for ammunition, and we'd never been on the rifle range yet.
Oh, is that right?
So we thought that boy really was an interested boy.
Yeah, he knew what he was doing, right?
Right.
He was prepared. When you were going through any of your basic training, were you issued any leaves or passes, and if so, what kind of things did you use to do with your leaves and passes?
I didn't get a leave until I got to Fort Custer, and I did get a 7-day furlough from there, and I just came home with the marshal and did what I tried to do, what I used to do when I wasn't in the Army. And of course we had to wear a uniform. We couldn't go into civilian clothes of any type. And so then when I went back, while I was home, I think we attended a movie or two. And I got married in Paris, Texas. My wife was from here, and she came down there, and I just about through basic training when we got married May the 4th, 43.
So
I left.
And here you are, a pretty green soldier here at this time.
Yeah, I was a half hour late for the wedding. It was at 8 o'clock and didn't get there till 8:30. I moved out and left her there in Paris, Texas. She came down to Louisiana where we was at, and I got orders to move, and I left her sitting there. She'd come on the bus, you know. So then when I got to Patrick Henry, Virginia, why, she came down there too. And I moved out and left her there with a car. And anyway, I left her 3 times, and the 4th time I brought her home with me discharged.
Well, what do you recall about this time when you were going through your, really, what do you think about the places where you were stationed and maybe the friends that you made at this point?
I tried to make the best of everything that come along our way. Down at Patrick Henry, we pulled all kinds of guard duty, ammunition igloos and railroads, boxcars and warehouses, and I laughed and said I pulled about everything under the sun that an MP could pull except Arlington Cemetery. And one time we were on directing traffic. We didn't have traffic lights or anything, and Paul Brill and I were out one morning about 7 o'clock and in the fall, and he happened to be posted in front of the post headquarters, and 2 blocks down from him I was at the finance office, and here come the finance officer in his car, and he of course turned into the finance office, and I gave him a big salute, and he just waved at me. And so when he had passed Brill up there, and so when they picked us up in 4 hours and relieved us, I said, "Paul, what did you do to the finance officer this morning that he didn't salute me?" "Oh, hell," he said, "you ought to been there." I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "I was standing there," and he said, "Here he is sitting in front of me cranking his window down, and I didn't even know it until he was stopped cranking that window down." And he says, "What's the matter, MP? Is it too cold to salute this morning?" I said, "Well, what did you say?" I said, "Hell no, back up and come again, and I'll give you 2 of them." You know that officer, he was a major, he never saluted either one of us after that. He just waved at us.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you have much association, or did you interact with civilians through your time basic trainings?
No, not a whole lot. The only thing we'd have would be when my wife was with me, and we'd live in town, and I'd get off and I'd associate with the people that owned the place where we stayed, or the neighbors. That's about the extent of it.
What was your military unit? I know you said you were an MP, but were you assigned to a division, and did this division change when you were switched to different training facilities?
What we were in our basic was a 792nd MP Battalion, And then when I went down to Newport News, Virginia, I was in the 765th MP Battalion. That battalion was sent there to go to North Africa, but General Kilpatrick and 3rd Service Command was, well, maybe you've heard of him being as Madison Square Garden official. He would go to Washington every time we was supposed to ship out and cut the order somehow, and they finally got each one of us shipped out as a dozen or a bus or two below, you know, and replaced us with overseas troops in that battalion. That battalion never did leave Newport News.
Is that right? Well, as a MP, what was your assigned duties?
Do guard duty and traffic control and gates and warehouses and ammunition, ride trains with, sometimes we had to ride prisoner trains.
Please tell me a little bit about those prisoner trains. Did you have any interaction with German POWs?
No, they had a sea between them and their homeland, and they were pretty docile. The only thing is they brought some. We started out with the Italians, and then we began to get the Germans in, and we couldn't put them in the same stockade together. The Germans tried to kill the Italians, yeah, and so they made trustees out of the Italians and locked up the Germans.
What do you remember how the Germans looked? Were they in their uniforms, or were they had they been given, like, say, old fatigue, United States fatigues, or how did they look?
They wore their own uniforms, and they had, I reckon, work uniforms, the same as the other. But I don't recall them ever wearing army clothes, our army clothes.
Do you remember what kind of troops you saw? Were these Afrika Korps troops, or were they what they call the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe or Navy troops?
There was a mixture of them. Yeah, some of them were infantry, some of them were the tank corps, and some were Luftwaffe. I don't recall ever being in contact with an SS troop here in the States.
Did they look healthy? Did they look like a pretty fierce fighter?
Very healthy, very healthy. Yeah.
I guess the next, we're going to move into the phase of your departure from the United States overseas. Where did you go after completing your basic military training? We've covered that. When did you go overseas, and how did you get there?
We left Boston, Massachusetts from Camp Miles Standish, and like I said, boarded the USS West Point, which had been a luxury liner called the Newport News, and it was built at Newport News, Virginia. We landed at Glasgow, Scotland, got off that ship and got right on a train, went to Southampton, and as fast as we could move, we boarded a smaller English ship and went over to Le Havre, France. And of course they had to have landing barges we climbed down ropes and went ashore. They drive close to the shore. That town had been bombed so badly that they couldn't even get up to it. There wasn't any port there anymore. And his landing crafts had to take us ashore, but of course we waded water about knee deep from the landing craft to get onto the shore. We didn't stay there but about 2 days, and we got on a train there in Le Havre and went towards the front line, and we got so close, and the tracks weren't good enough, so then we had to get into some trucks, and the first place that we stopped was at near Metz. There was a military academy there, and we had taken that over for replacements. I mean, people coming in. I was a replacement going overseas.
What was the date in which you landed at Le Havre?
It must have been sometime around last of February, 1st of March.
1940?
44. No.
45.
45, yeah.
Well, what were you assigned to do after arriving in France?
Well, we didn't have any rifles, and they issued us rifles there at this academy that we were bivouacked in, and we did go out and kind of zero the rifles in on the range, and then they loaded us in truck and took us right straight to our 87th Division.
The 87th Division.
Yeah, I was in the Company I of the 347th Regiment.
Maybe write that down. That was Company I.
Yeah,
One more time, please.
Company I, 347th Regiment, 87th Infantry Division.
Well, what did you think of the nation's war effort up to this point? You had probably seen quite a bit in the United States. You saw prisoners coming, and then you were sent over to France, and you said that it was pretty much bombed. It was taking its toll on the city. Did you have any thoughts about what had been going on so far and how the war was going?
It had been kind of, to start with, kind of strung out, but it was beginning to come to a close. And I thought a lot of times that the United States didn't know what a war really was, because they had never been hit by any kind of a war here except the Civil War, and of course that was a completely different. Those towns over there were completely demolished. I have a couple of books up there, and I can show you pictures, and some of the pictures I took myself and sent them back to headquarters company to get developed, and they told me my film wasn't any good or my camera wasn't any good. I bought the book when we got deactivated at Fort Benning, Georgia, and a few years later, after I'd got out of the service, they mailed it to me, and I found some of my pictures in it.
We're in the book.
Right.
Well, that's fascinating. If you do not immediately enter a combat zone, where did you go before entering combat? Was this
what they called a repo depot is a replacement center. It was just a large area and wooded area. The one I was in a wooded area and mountainous area, and a lot of 5-man tents, and it's just a replacement depot. And there was not only us new people from the States there, but others from hospitals and places that recuperated enough to get back in the process of getting back to their outfits.
Tell us about your experience or entering your first combat zone. What was that experience like?
It was evening time, and we got up where they unloaded us off the trucks, and about 5 miles from this little town where we unloaded in the evening, they told us we'd stay there until morning. And so we did, and that night we could hear all the commotion in another town about 3-4 miles from us, and we knew they was having quite a fight over in that town, but it was further it was on the front lines. So the next day we went up there, and they didn't move that day. They had went into that town the night that we stopped at our town, and they didn't have time to dig in foxholes or anything, and the Germans came back and tried to retake the town at night, and it was quite a fight, I guess. And so they had dug in when we got up there, and they weren't really expecting any of us new fellows, and we had to sleep in 2-man foxholes with 3 of us. Of course, we didn't have time to dig our own holes, so they just put us in with the rest of us, made it close quarters, but that was all right. We was safe. We felt safer with them than if we'd had our own. And of course, when that first night, I stood my watch, same as the rest, and out in front of us, I noticed a lantern walking around out in there. And the next morning, I told one of my buddies, I told him what I saw, and he said, well, he'd been there a while, and he said, why didn't you shoot it out? And I said, well, we've got a foxhole on each side of us here, about 20 feet apart, and they've surely seen it if I seen it, and they was probably more experienced than me, and if they didn't want to shoot at that thing, I wasn't about to shoot at it. Well, he said I'd have shot it out. I said, yeah, and you'd had another fight like you had the night before. And anyway, that kind of stuck with me. But
were a lot of the troops that you were up there, where they had, let me use the term, seasoned veterans, they had been there for a while?
yeah, more or less, yeah.
What were those men like? You folks.
Quiet.
Really?
Never said much. Not much joking. We had one American Indian in our company and 2 Mexicans. And the Mexicans were from California, and I don't know where this Indian came from. But anyway, then we had a bunch of fellows from Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia, and of course Chicago and Ohio. And these point men were the ones that were always quiet. They never said anything. They just stood around and waited for orders, and then we'd take off, and they would lead the boys, and we'd follow where they led us. But they knew where they were supposed to go from the captain.
But how old was the average trooper that you served with over there?
They were my age, or well, there was some a little older, but there was a few that was younger. We had a couple of 17-year-olds. They'd lied about their age, and they had enough experience that when I got there, they were corporals, and they were good ones.
Taking these one at a time or in chronological order, please tell us in full detail, if possible, about the approximate number and types of casualties that occurred that you saw, and how were they treated? Was there facilities to take care of these troops close by?
We always had medics with us, and if the medic couldn't take care of them, why, they'd take them back on a jeep or something called a jeep up. A field artillery observer usually had a jeep, and they'd load them on the hood of the jeep or in the back seat, and take the ones that the medics couldn't handle back to the receiving center.
Do you remember your first experience of actual contact with the enemy or German soldiers on the line?
Yeah. The first contact I remember, I never saw them, but they were shooting at us and they had us pinned down. And our platoon guide was a tech sergeant from St. Louis, and he carried a Tommy gun. He traded a Luger that he'd taken off of a prisoner to the tankers for a Tommy gun, which we had about 5 or 6 Tommy guns in our company, and the tankers kept us supplied with .45 ammunition. And anyway, when we'd go into a town, we'd look for snipers, something to eat, and something to drink. And of course, the drink kind of kept us on our toes. And anyway, we got pinned down, and it was just somebody pop his head up out of a ravine, and take shots at us. And there was just a platoon of us, and we was kind of in an open spot. And anyway, Sergeant Crump says, if you fellas will cover me, I'll run over there and get that so-and-so. Well, when he run over there with his Tommy gun, why, he jumped in this ravine, and of course it was deeper than he was tall, and that Tommy gun, it just talked to be the blue streak, and pretty soon he crawled up over the bank and waved and said, it's all clear, come on over. And there was 8 of them in there, and he killed all 8 of them. And of course, that's a thing that I didn't get involved in, only to cover him,
Did your mental attitude change as combat continued?
Well, yes. Our division took Buchenwald concentration camp at Weimar, Germany. And when we saw what was going on there, our attitudes all changed.
Well, tell me about that experience. I know that I've heard accounts of that, but you're the first one veteran I've interviewed that has had actual experience at a concentration camp.
Well,
but tell me, I guess let me back up. I'd like to know how, if you were, did you happen upon the concentration camp just in part of your advancing? Did you know where you were going, and what was your reaction when you first got there?
Really, I wasn't in the lead outfit. I was there after they'd really broken into it. The guards all left, and they shot the locks off the gates and then went on in. And these prisoners, they were just skin and bones. There was one wagon type hayrack loaded with bodies. They were burning them in their crematory. And of course, they showed us what their kitchen. It was a big pressure cooker, hold about, some of those pressure cookers would hold 100 gallons, and they fed them soup mostly. And their barracks was just on each wall was shelves, like shelves in a pantry or something in a store, and they laid on those boards, and they had maybe one blanket apiece. And some of the barracks didn't have any heat in them at all, and of course they had watchtowers around. While I was there, I had a camera, and I took some pictures, and inside the buildings the pictures didn't mount anything because it didn't have flash, and it was fairly dark in them. But after I took some pictures, I went up in one of the towers, nobody around, and I climbed up in one of them and took a picture of the whole camp. And of course I kept those pictures, and I brought them home with me and had them developed at home. And anyway, this Buchenwald concentration camp, that's where the commandant of the camp's wife wanted all the tattoos, and she made lampshades out of them. I saw lampshade after lampshade with tattoos on the shades.
I've seen that pictures in books.
They were there. Now, the Burgermeister, the mayor of Weimar, the officers went and got him and brought him up there to see what was going on. And he didn't think that ever happened, but after they turned them loose and took them back down to Weimar, that night they both committed suicide.
When do you remember the camp people who were there? What was their reaction to the United States forces? I know that there had to be a certain amount of joy and relief that they survived. But
yeah.
Did any of the men that maybe that you came in contact with, did they share stories of maybe what some of these initial reaction was when they liberated the camp?
Really, we didn't do too much communicating. I didn't know anything except English, and unless somebody could speak English that was over there, I didn't communicate with them. I was just at that time I was still a private. I hadn't even got PFC rating back yet, and of course a private, he stays in the background and only does what he's told to do, but you got your eyes and your ears open.
I believe Buchenwald is, if I'm not mistaken, is that the camp in which Eisenhower toured shortly after it was liberated?
I think it was. It was up on the mountaintops where it was at.
How big was the camp?
I don't know. It was, I keep trying to remember if I'd read how many acres it covered, but I'd say there was maybe 100 barracks.
Was it men and women, or just basically men that you saw?
All I saw was men.
Could you tell if they were primarily Jewish, or were they, sometimes they're prisoners of war,
Yes,
say Russian prisoners?
you could tell the Jews because they had the Star of David pin on their uniform. What kind of uniform they'd have, they all had to wear that Star of David if they were Jewish.
Do you know if there were any German troops who were captured before they could depart from the camp?
I'm pretty sure there was a few, but not too many. But I wasn't involved in that.
Well, you said your attitude changed. maybe tell me a little bit, let's talk about that, about how that changed after you saw.
We really didn't believe anybody could treat other people like that. You know, humans treat humans worse than animals treat animals. Animals have respect for each other in all ways, unless they're forced to fight. Animals won't fight. But humans, they just look around. It seems to me like sometimes they try to pick a fight.
Just want to make sure. Okay, we got plenty of time, so I want to go on. Well, I'm going to change and talk a little bit about this. While you were overseas, did you write many letters home?
Possibly one a week. That's about as often as you could do it. Other than that, you was on the move a lot.
Well, did you receive many packages or letters? And if so, how often? And what type
Well,
of things did you get?
We get mail every other day at least. Sometimes we get mail every day for a couple of days, and sometimes, when we got mail, pretty near everybody got a letter or something, you know. Of course, there's some of them that never got any mail at all. And anyway, the cooks usually brought it up when they brought their food up. Of course, there's days they didn't get up to either. So those days we didn't get any food, and then we'd get supplies such as ammunition and rations, K rations. We lived on K rations.
What was in K rations? Describe a typical meal that you would eat.
A box of K rations was about the size of a Cracker Jack box, and it had a can of cheese or some kind of meat. Your breakfast had ham and eggs in a little can, about like a tuna can that would fit in that box. And there was a package of maybe 4 or 5 crackers like you'd get at the restaurant in a package, you know. And I remember there'd be about 4 cigarettes in a little package. You'd have a D bar, which is a chocolate bar. Now, you had a breakfast, you had a dinner, and you had a supper. And of course it varied what they put in each one. Your breakfast was a little different than your dinner, and your supper was probably a repeat of the dinner. And it was all concentrated food.
What'd you think of it?
It was pretty good when we get it, but I didn't think it was so bad. I don't know if any of them ever threw any of it away. They eat it, they'd put maybe that D bar, it'd be hard as a rock, that D bar, and anyway, it was chocolate, and you could eat on it and put it back in your pocket and eat on it later. And of course we had instant coffee. We had lemon powder, and I remember in particular most of us would save our lemon. It would be in our dinner meal usually. Coffee in the breakfast and maybe coffee in their supper. And anyway, we'd save up that lemon stuff, and we'd get a canteen cup of water, about a half a canteen cup of water, and dump 4 or 5 packages of that lemon stuff in there. You'd be so draggy you just felt like you couldn't go anymore. You dump all those packages in there, shake it up, stir it up, and drink her down, and boy, I'll tell you, that woke you up. Lemon, I never drank any lemonade as strong as we made it. Of course, our coffee was the same way.
Well, how often did you have a hot meal?
About every other day. Sometimes the cooks couldn't get anything up there hot. If we got to, you know, when you go through on the front line, you leapfrog through. Your outfit will go through another outfit that's holding a position, fight your way to where you have to stop and dig in, and then there'd be another fresh outfit come right on through your lines and do the same thing. And when we'd get bypassed maybe twice, the cooks would bring us up something, because the fighting was really a mile or 2 ahead of us. And they'd come up that close and give us hot meals. And it was always appreciated.
What type of hot meal did you have? Do you remember?
A lot of it was stew. I remember one time we run into a place and we thought we had run into some flour. And of course we was always robbing the chicken nests around and getting eggs, and we got a bunch of eggs and asked our cooks, our company cook, and his men to make us some hot cakes out of this flour, and anyway, when they started frying them, we was all lined up to get them, and the blooming things, they weren't cooking, they just turning gray, and somebody said, "Let me have one anyway," and what it was is some sort of plaster Paris that they'd made a bunch of hot cakes out of, and we had to eat we had to eat our K rations that day. We didn't get our hot cakes.
Well, we talked about writing letters and eating and things. Well, did you forge close bonds of friendship with any or many of your companions in combat?
Their family. We had our 45th reunion, our division did at Louisville, Kentucky this last September.
How many of you showed up for the reunion?
Wives and all, there was about 50 of us in our company. But there was about 1,200 altogether. We were at the Galt House, and of course it could accommodate us, and there was about 1,200 altogether, and there's always a few first-timers, and then we have one couple that's been to every one of those reunions except for one, and of course we all stand up and they say everybody that has been to less than 10, sit down. Well, there's a bunch goes down. Then they'll say, everybody that's been to less than 20, you can sit down. And when the time comes, there's just one couple standing.
Is that right? Well, what are some things that maybe since you've met with, like say your reunion, has there been anything that you learned at some of these reunions that maybe you didn't know at the time that you went through during the war?
We were scheduled, our division general volunteered our division to go to the South Pacific just as soon as VE Day hit. Of course, we had to stay over there in full occupation duty until we could get regular troops to do that job, and we were one of the first divisions to come back from overseas. And anyway, this last reunion we had, we got a paper that had all the statistics of the invasion of Japan, and then even to the divisions that was to participate, and we were one of them. Charles Pruitt lives across the street, and he was in the 44th, and he was scheduled to go too. But to get a 30-day recuperation at home before we went, and we were home when Japan surrendered. This 87th Division reassembled at Fort Benning, Georgia. They were the first division to be deactivated after World War I or II.
We're going to pick up where we left off here, and we covered letters. We covered, that you have remained in contact with a number of these fellas, over the years. And tell me, let me ask another question, going back to combat experiences. Did you ever have to retrieve a wounded buddy from a field of combat or anything like that?
I personally didn't. I've seen others do it, but no, not me.
Well, during your combat duty, did you ever capture any enemy prisoners?
Yes.
Yeah. Describe the circumstances.
We were at a little town. We were in Germany, and we were in what they called was Russian territory. We waited a week at Thuma, Germany, and nothing happened. The Russians couldn't get to us. We were in German ground, but it was Russian divided up for the Russians to take it, and we went and done ours, and now we was into their territory. And then we pushed off from there and went over to a little town called Tannensburg, and as we went into this little town, there was 3 Germans. We saw them, and there was about a half a dozen of us guys right there, and of course one of those was a paratrooper, but he was a young fella, and he had kept trying to keep his hands on his head and still grunting and pointing to his leg, and he had a zipper pocket in his leg here. And I finally said, "Go ahead, get it." And he zipped it down and pulled out a paratrooper knife. And it was had a blade. You flip a little thing and flip like that, and the blade jumped right straight out, and you locked it. And on the other end was an ice pick. So you had a handle, ice pick, and a blade. I got it here. I brought it home with me. But he was scared to death he'd get caught with it, you know.
But how old were the troops?
He was about 17 or 18.
Did you ever have any occurrence to run into any SS troops while you were there? That maybe you were aware of?
We had 3 German generals in our PW enclosure at the end of the war. And there might have been some SS in there, but they wouldn't disclose themselves if they could help it.
What was the general attitude about the SS at this time? I know that you were, the time frame we're talking now is 1945. In December of 1944, of course, were the atrocities by the SS at Normandy during the Battle of the Bulge. I know that had a lot of, that affected a lot of people's attitudes. Do you remember the kind Okay.
The first thing we were taught about SS troops is never to trust one of them. And if you saw the first thing out of him, just shoot him, because they were the most active of all of them. Some of them you kind of felt sorry for them because they older men. They was dirty, just as dirty as we were, and we knew how we were living, and we knew they was living more or less the same way. We never trusted an SS trooper. We were taught not to, told us, if you see one, cripple him so as he can't do much.
Raymond, what would you say would be the highlight occurrence of your combat experience?
The thing I remember a lot is when the war ended, all these troops were trying to surrender to us. They were coming in so fast we couldn't even interrogate them. And after a week, we were telling the prisoners if they knew where to go home. Didn't want to interrogate any more prisoners. They were just so many of them, and displaced persons all over the place. And each one was trying to survive himself. There wasn't any supplies for them. We were trying to supply them as well as ourselves. They just didn't have anything to do. I laughed and said it was some of the best guard duty I ever pulled, because those prisoners would play a lot of them had musical instruments. They'd play music all night long and sleep all day. And it was, I pulled guard duty around them. We had a machine gun set up on one corner and catty-cornered across the enclosure with another machine gun. And then there'd be 2 of us walking each side. And sometimes we'd talk to these officers, these German generals. They laughed at the way we pulled guard duty. Of course, they were spit and polished, you know. And here we was, looked like bums. And I remember talking to one German. He could speak better English than we could speak, but we liked to listen to him talking. He said if we'd had the American Army, we'd have whipped the world. He said, you fellas never knew when to quit. Said we give our men orders and they do what we were told them to do. But he said they wouldn't do anything else. Even if they knew they could go a little farther and get more accomplished, they wouldn't do it. They just sat and waited in new order. And that's what they didn't like about it. But they didn't feel too bad over it. We had one professor that had been drafted into the Army, and he'd been a university professor, and he was talking to us one evening. And
He was a German soldier?
yeah,
Okay.
he was a corporal. Can you imagine a professor in a university with a corporal rating? He was pretty mad because he was drafted. And anyway, one of our boys said, well, you know, when are you fellas going to learn? We whipped you in World War I. And he said, whoa, wait a minute now. He said, you didn't whip us in World War I. There was an armistice signed. And they made this boy, we called him Limey. He was, his name was Rector. And he wasn't too big, but oh, he'd get so mad and cuss up a storm. And boy, he whirled around and shook his finger in that guy's nose, and he said, you son of a bitch, you can't deny you've been whipped now. And this professor never batted an eye. He said, yeah, that's right, you got us whipped. But he said, there may be another time. And I'll never forget that, especially it came back to mind real plain when they put Germany back together. That scares me. Because there's people over there that don't believe that half of the atrocities that was committed ever happened.
That's right. Tell us what you and the other men did to celebrate, like, say, America's traditional family holidays, such as Thanksgiving or Christmas. Did you guys do anything special, or you're away from home? So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, holidays we hardly knew it. There's a story in my scrapbooks. John McFarland was from Chicago. He was an Irishman and a big fella, and he was a cook. And he told the newspapers in Chicago about Christmas. He said, I had 35 frozen turkeys. I dropped in some vats to cook for the boys in my company. He wasn't in my outfit. I mean, he was in the 87th Division, but he was in a different, I think, 345th maybe. And he said they were all up there, but they was going to get relieved and come back for their dinner, Christmas dinner. Said we had it ready for them, a company of 200. And when the company come back to get their Christmas dinner, we had 35 turkeys. It was 35 men. He said, a turkey for everybody.
So they had that many losses from that one particular day. 165 men. When and how did you return to the U.S. after the end of the war?
We pulled some occupation duty and then loaded on boxcars and came back. Rode 3 days and 3 nights from over near Czechoslovakian border. And we stopped at Camp Oklahoma City, and we rode boxcars all the way. And we stayed there a couple of nights in a big, large tents. We had canvas cots. And we thought, boy, that'll be great. We got a cot to lay on instead of the ground. And I got so cold that night in that tent, with no heat, that I got my blanket and rolled up in it and laid under alongside the cot on the ground. It was warmer there than it was in that canvas cot. Only had one blanket anyway, and the next morning when I woke up, I looked and there wasn't a cot with anybody in it. It was all laying on the ground. So then we left there in a couple of days and went to Camp Lucky Strike at Le Havre, France. And we was there and got some new clothes and turned in all of our ammunition that we had and everything. We kept it till we got back to the Lucky Strike. Then on the 4th day of July, they said, boys, we're going to board ship and we went down to get on the landing craft to take us out to the ship. Lewis Milks and I went over together, and he and I were in the same company. And Milks, alphabetically, was just before Miller. And I said, Lewis, look at that ship sitting out there in the harbor. That looks like the West Point to me. And he said, yeah, it does look like it. As soon as we got out, got over there and climbed up the ropes to get on the thing, I looked around and hollered at a couple of sailors, and I said, what ship is this? Is it the West Point? And he said, it sure is. And he and I and all that went over with us came back on that same ship. I said, where have you fellas been? And he said, we've been around the Horn of Africa. So we landed at New York City when we came back.
Well, how many months were you over in Europe from the time that you landed at Harvard until you reboarded the ship to come back?
Well, we got on the ship on the 4th day of July of 45, and we went over in either the 1st of March or the last of February. So that had been the month of March, April, May, June. That'd been 4 months, but we covered an awful lot of territory.
Yeah, it sure looked like you did. All the way from France to Czechoslovakia. Did you have any encounters? I'm backing up a little bit, but did you have any encounters with Russian soldiers while you were over there?
I saw 2 Russian soldiers, and they had been prisoners of war, and we liberated them before the end of the war. And they were crazy. They were like a couple of grade school kids. They got an old little wagon, and they'd ride downhill on that wagon. Just push the one, and he'd ride, and then he'd pull it back up there, and the other would get in and ride. Just like a couple of grade school kids.
So you think that the experience as prisoners of war just kind of weighed heavy on them?
I don't know what happened, but they was having a kid, just like a kid out of school, both of them. That's the only 2 Russians that I'd seen that I would know as the Russians, because we liberated them with a bunch of other POWs.
What happened when you arrived in the U.S.?
Well, we landed at New York City and got on a ferry and went over to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and we got over there about midnight, and they put us all in a recreation hall, and I think he was a captain, give us a talk before they let us go to our barracks. And he said another thing. He said, all these barracks now, boys, has got a T in front of their number. Every barracks is numbered. He said that T stands for temporary, but not right now. They're going to be tore down. We want you to leave them stand. And we was there about 3 days, I suppose, and they shipped each one out to our own service command, and I went to Camp Grant up at Rockford, and I left there and came home for 30 days and reported back at Camp Grant, and then went to Fort Benning, Georgia.
And what happened at Fort Benning, Georgia?
We were there, 2 or 3 weeks maybe. And then the division was deactivated, and I was sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And I was working in classification section of Army personnel in an office when I got discharged. And I wasn't due to get discharged at that time, but we were processing discharges. Some were making it, some weren't. And I looked at them all, and I told my sergeant he was getting discharged, and he had been in quite a while. I said, Sergeant, I think I'll put in for my discharge. I won't be able to get out on the regular point system until next month. He said, well, you won't hurt nothing. See, we had a major and a captain and a lieutenant that was on the discharge board, and the captain and the major was in charge of our classification personnel there working. So I put my application in, and it just went right through, and I got discharged on the 16th of December in the 45. And ordinarily, if I'd have waited till my name come up or something, it'd have been in January, because it's in January to give me a full 3 years in the service.
Well, tell me about your rank at the time that you were discharged, and maybe any decorations and campaign decorations you might have received while you were...
Well, I got the American Theater and the ETO, European Theater of Operation. They got 2 stars on that.
And those are battle stars?
Yeah, they designated different times of the war.
You know what campaigns
Like
they would
crossing.
be? Well, you know what campaigns they would represent? Those.
One would be in the battle. Well, our division got the Battle of the Bulge, but I didn't get that. I got the crossing of the Rhine River in central Germany.
Okay.
That was the 2 last ones issued. And then they gave us a victory medal and the occupation ribbon. Of course, I had a good conduct thing. And a few years ago, I wrote down to St. Louis to see if I couldn't get all my stuff. I had to come and I got a letter back and said they would be mailed to me. And when they came, there was a bronze star in it too.
Is that right?
I didn't know that was coming.
Do you know what the Bronze Star was for?
This paper said, because we had a combat infantry badge, we were entitled by a congressional act that anybody that got a combat infantry badge, and it's the blue one, you know, with a rifle on it and a wreath. They had infantry badges without the wreath, but the wreath meant combat. Anybody that got a combat infantry badge was going to be awarded a Bronze Star.
Did you retain all your medals? Do you still have them?
Yeah, they're in here in a little vault we got in here in the closet.
Tell me this. Sometimes I've been told that Americans were great souvenir keepers and retainers. Did you bring home any souvenirs?
Yeah.
From your experience? Tell me about those.
Well, I brought home a P-38 revolver and a Czechoslovakian-made 32. That P-38 was 9mm. And I've still got the little Mauser 25 automatic. You can lay it on the table and lay your hand on it and hide it. And then I got belt buckles off the prisoners, and I got some of their stuff they wore on their chest, medals and stuff. I got a few of those. I got a Hitler Youth knife with the swastika on the handle. And yeah, we used to go into town and we'd pick up stuff you wouldn't believe and head for the next town carrying it, and you'd get heavy and we'd throw it off, and then here comes somebody behind us and they'd see what we threw off. They'd throw something off and pick up something we'd dropped. I even had a set of binoculars that come off of an 88mm German field artillery. Those, the big ends of those was each one that big. So big they had to put them on a tripod or else mount them on that 88 to look through them. And you didn't look straight through them. You looked down about a 45 degree and then out through them.
Oh, is it with the glass angles in there?
Yeah, and I had a set of them, and Henry Searman in Chicago, I was going to throw them because I was tired of carrying them. He said, I'll carry them a while, and he's just a little fella. He still got them. He said, I've been aiming to bring them to a reunion and just never think that when I leave to bring them. And then, of course, we all were souvenir hunters. We just pick up anything and everything. This sets up here. That's German. That's about all I got in here that I can show you, but I got a foot locker out in the garage. It's got a bunch of stuff in it. Those are 630s there.
Was there anything that you had that maybe you got rid of that, boy, you wish you would have retained or kept?
Yeah, I had some Hitler. Like I said, I had 2 of those Hitler Youth knives, and I gave my buddy one. And then I had another. They had another organization, and they had a sword about that long. I called it a dagger. And it said on there, all is for the fatherland.
All for German, all is for Deutschland.
Yeah.
Sure.
And then this Hitler Youth knife says blood and fire. engraved on the blade. They were parade things.
Mm-hmm. I know that some of the things that I happen to have, I was fortunate enough that a couple of things that were brought back to me were German tunics. I have complete German tunics of one German officer and then just a non-commissioned officer. So and I have them on mannequins along with my American uniform. I think it's fascinating. Well, how did you get along with the men with whom you had the greatest contact with over there?
Got along fine.
Were there things you would do differently if you could do them once again?
Well, I doubt it, because with the training we had, we were more or less on automatic pilot, you might say. And I suppose we do it the same way we did. We didn't do anything the way that the Germans thought we ought to have done it. That's the reason we won the war. They told us so. Said, you fellas never showed up where we was expecting.
What was the most difficult thing you had to do during your period of military service?
Well, when I was in the EMPs down at Patrick Henry, Virginia, we had to take our turns of guarding the wax barracks. I guess that would be about the most difficult, because there's always, and they were right back to back in the same block of the service club. Of course, they had a high board fence, about as high as this ceiling, around them, except on their roadside, and it was open. It was a U-shaped fence. But there was always some of those boys trying to get over that fence. They'd lock the gate. They had a gate that went to the service club through that. But they'd lock it at night. But, you know, there's always somebody trying to climb that fence.
Sure. Would the girls tend to tease the boys at times and get their attention?
You better believe it. Of course, us MPs, we had one man walked in the road in front, and then one walked in the back on the boardwalk behind the barracks. And one night, one of them got over, and of course, the guy in the back just stepped behind the tree. As soon as he hit the ground on the barracks side, the MP stepped out with a shotgun. We had double aughts, and hollered halt at him, and he run down through between two barracks, and he fired at him as he jumped the road ditch. He saw the MP at the other end, and he went the other direction. So we went to the orderly room and called up the sergeant of the guard, and he come down there. He said, I think I hit him, but I don't know. And the sergeant said, well, I'll start looking around some of these infirmaries, and we'll see. He found it. Medics was picking the pellets out of his legs. Asked him where he got it. He said, oh, I just got down. Said, got in an awful ruckus down there. Said, you all been there? Sarge, he said, there's a heck of a fight downtown, you know.
Yeah, telling stories.
He said, well, you better stay away from the wax barracks. It didn't hurt him too bad, but he had him.
Got his attention then.
Yeah.
Well, is there any one thing that stands out as your most successful achievement in your military service?
Well, I guess the end of the war would have been about the most outstanding when we heard that it was all over.
Well, how did you learn about VE Day, and what was your reaction to it?
Well, we waited, and we knew it was coming a few days, maybe a week ahead at the time, but we just, I don't know, we sat around and cleaned their weapons and stuff like that, waiting on the Russians to come to meet us, and we never did see them as a group to come and meet us. There was other units that did meet them, but we just had all these prisoners to take care of, and finally we just moved out and turned it over to others, and moved back this way, back away from Czechoslovakia, because we was right on the Czech border. And the Russians, I guess, finally came in and took over because we were in Russian territory. And of course, we had a lot of occupation duty to pull, like crossroads and stuff like that. And in towns, we had to pull that until we got more relief of regular occupation troops.
Well, how did you learn about VJ Day and what was your reaction to it?
It was home. That's a story too. Well, it was home, and I went out to the fair. The fair was going on, and I never paid that much attention. I didn't know anybody was around. Here come another Army soldier down through the fairground walking, and I noticed he had a golden acorn on his shoulder. It was Bon Thompson's boy, Sonny Thompson. Bud Burkett, you know Bud Burkett?
No.
His wife's brother. And he was in the 346 and I was in the 347. And of course, we talked a while, and when he got discharged, they talked him into staying in the inactive reserves. They called him back and he got killed in Korea. Now, on the night that we found out that Japan surrendered, it was evening time as near as I can remember. My wife's folks lived over on North 5th Street. Frank Mitchell lived next door. And the Clark boy lived across the street. And we were having one heck of a ball. Everybody was a-hooping and a-hollering it up. O.J. Kaiser was the mayor, and he lived just in the next block south. He called the law. This was after midnight. We was really romping her up. Here come the city police, one city police, all they had. He confiscated Fenton Fraker, state trooper. He came up with him, pulled up to the side, and Fenton says, "What's going on, boys?" And of course, Frank Mitchell, you remember Frank maybe you don't. Frank said, "By God," Fenton said, "don't you know the war's ended?" Fenton says, "Yeah." I said, "I just got informed about it, and you fellas are celebrating up here." I said, "Do you know the mayor lives right down the next block?" Frank says, "Sure, I know where the mayor lives, but who cares?" And Fenton said, "Well," said he called us, and we were supposed to come up here and quiet you down. So if you could kind of quiet it down just a little bit, he'll know we've been here. Thank you. And they took off. Of course, by that time we was ready to go to bed. It must have been 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, what was your opinion of the use of the atomic bomb when it was used against the Japanese?
It was the best thing that ever happened. And the first one didn't seem to get their attention, but the second one did. And if it hadn't been for that, there's no telling how many troops would have been lost.
Has that opinion changed over the last 50 years?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Don't think so. It hasn't for me, at least. I've got a thing here trying to find. There's that turkey thing, I think. Well, I don't know what I've done with it. I loaned it to Charlie Pruitt over here, and he made a copy of it. It was all about the invasion of Japan, and we would have had an awful tough fight because they were really ready for us. If it hadn't been for the atomic bombs, we'd lost so many men, been pitiful.
Well, when and where were you officially discharged from the service?
At Fort Dix, New Jersey,
And when was that?
December the 16th, 1945.
Okay.
That's the time I brought my wife home with me.
Now,
I didn't leave her there.
She was from Marshall.
Yeah, she was a Spittler.
A Spittler.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any opinions or feelings about our nation's military status or its policies as maybe today compared to those in 1945?
I've always felt like we should be prepared for anything that happens. I don't believe in going overseas and trying to intervene in a lot of things that you can't solve. But I think we should be able to protect ourselves here. Every generation has its own battles to fight. We solved our problem in our day, but they've got battles and they've got problems to solve today. And it's up to the generation of today to solve.
Do you have any contact with the Veterans Administration?
I'm registered in Danville, but I never go up. They told me I apparently got too good income to participate in their programs. Some of the boys do go up, but if they got Medicare and they got a Medicare supplement insurance, they collect through them. The VA does through their Medicare and their supplement insurance. They have to pay that. The only really the benefit is, from what I hear, is those boys gets their prescriptions filled up there, and the VA knows how to get reimbursed from the Medicare and supplement insurance for that medication. Of course, I don't take any medication, so I wouldn't benefit by going up there anyway.
Well, what's your opinion of the VA?
It's very good. There's been places where they could have done better, but as a whole, I think they do a good job.
Would you like to tell us about how your family supported you during your military life?
Well, they were very supportive. Of course, my dad being a World War I veteran, why, naturally I had all his support, and of course, the family at home they really felt good about it. I mean, they really give us all the support. They'd write to us whether we wrote or not.
Well, over the years, what has this support meant to you?
Quite a bit. I'll show you a card. I wrote an article or two for the Choice paper. I saved that. That's from Mary Blagg. You know Mary. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate people still give us support. And I just got that letter not too long ago, just before November 11th. I got that from that little girl. I don't know what grade she's in, up at the North Elementary School. And that's the Sathry woman that's in with Mealing and Bernardoni. That's her daughter.
This is a little card that was made for you, and it's dated November 9th, 1994. And it says, "Dear Mr. Miller, you've been talking about why we celebrate Veterans Day, and you helped us keep our freedom, democracy, and freedom of religion. Thanks for all you've done. Sincerely, Bess S. Wolf." So that's a real sweet, and you say she's just a grade schooler.
Yeah, and Wanda Spitler told me that little girl is Marshall Sathry's granddaughter, and that Wanda Spitler's daughter is the teacher of that little girl. And I got a card, and a thank you card, and I wrote a few notes in it and sent it to her, and then I got a card for her teacher and complimented her on teaching patriotic. I said something to the effect that you don't see too many teachers that go out of their way to teach love of God and country, and I appreciate anyone that does. And I said, of course, some people call it patriotism, and I haven't heard from either one of them since. Now, this thing here, I'll probably keep that a while, and one of these days I'll probably take it up and give it to her mother, because her mother probably never saw it. But I'll give it to her, and then she's got the letter I give her, and her teacher.
Keep that in her scrapbook, or when she gets older, she'd appreciate that.
That's the way I probably will do it.
Well, how did your experiences during World War II affect your life since that time?
Well, I spent about 7 years on the police force here, and if I hadn't been in the military, I'd never have been there, I don't reckon. I don't know, being in the military police, Al Edwards hired me as a policeman. I'd worked for John McCauley. He was mayor before Al Edwards was, and I broke vacations on police force for them. I worked for 6 different mayors.
Is that right? How many years did you say you served as a police officer here?
7.
7 years.
I was chief when I went over on the gas department. Buddy Ferris put me on the gas department, and I had some schooling in gas surface combustion. I'd worked for Wayne Hollenbeck some, and of course I'd went to school over at Columbus, Ohio, on what they call surface combustion. And so when I found out that the gas department was going to be opened up here and they'd put in the gas system, I asked Buddy for the job. The superintendent called Jack Pine said he wouldn't have anything to do with it. He was over everything else. He said, I don't want nothing to do with the gas.
So that became your job.
So I was chief of police, and Buddy said, do you still want that job since you went to chief of police now? And of course I'd made asking for it before I was chief of police. I said yes. I'd rather have that than be a policeman. So he gave it to me, and that's what I retired from. I was the only gas department superintendent. Never been another one.
Is that right?
I turned it all over to George Smith, and he handles all of it.
Well, do you feel your wartime contribution to the nation has been appreciated?
Yeah, I think so. I really do. I think the community around here does anyway. There may be some places and some areas that it isn't, but I think Marshall is very appreciative of what was done.
Well, Raymond, I want to thank you for cooperating with this project. I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to sit down and talk with me. And you know, we've had this nice discussion here for the last hour and say an hour and a half, and I really think it's an important thing for us to talk to you veterans and get your stories down, because you know, we have the stories of the politicians and the commanding officers, but I think that the stories of the experiences of the average GI are sometimes overlooked or forgotten. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Illinois Historical Society for sitting down for this interview.
Well, I'm glad you got to interview me. I appreciate your efforts too. I don't know, you'll get a different story from every one you interview.
In every one of them, every story comes together, you know, and builds the whole picture. And I think for me personally, as a 34-year-old, 33-year-old man, it has made that period of history a little bit more real to me, because these are, you know, I've seen the pictures of Patton, I've seen the pictures of Churchill, but when I know that I walk the streets with what I really classify as my hometown heroes, you know, I appreciate that, and it's made it a little more real. Thanks, Raymond.
You bet. You're welcome. The captain came up and he said, Miller, you go with Sergeant Crump back to this area that we bypassed, see if there's any troops, German troops still back there. So Crump and I took off, just the two of us. We didn't know what we was going to run into, but I was very confident he knew what he was doing. He'd been there a long time. And anyway, we got back there and he said, well, this is the area. And I was looking all around, and it was beginning to get a little bit evening, you know. And because the rest of the company was digging in to stay for the night where we were at. And he said, you know, they haven't been gone long, because I can still smell them. And I thought, smell them? Kraut. I sniffed around in that evergreen woods. Sure enough, you could smell kraut. Yeah, and you could see where they had bivouacked. They'd pitched their tents, you know. But they'd moved out and left. Then another time we went into Saalfeld, Germany. At night we walked, a whole company of us went down the railroad track. And it was getting dark and looked like fireflies going by, and boy, we all hit the ground. We sent a couple of guys up ahead, and there was a machine gun with a bunch of 2 or 3 boys on this machine gun. The German soldiers had left, but left these 3 young boys to run that machine gun. And of course, as soon as they got them taken care of, we just walked on down the railroad track. And you never heard of nothing. The whole company walked down that railroad track to Saalfeld, Germany. We went into that town, and they didn't know we were in that town at night. And we kind of went in different groups. And my squad was supposed to go up this one street. We just crossed a little canal bridge, and there was a street come from our right down along the canal. And there was one guy ahead of me, and there was about 4 or 5 behind me. And I heard Germans leaving town. They didn't know any Americans was in there, and they was on these brick pavements, you know, and they had them hard-soled shoes, and we could hear them a-coming. So the guy ahead of me, I just sat down on my heels and throwed my safety off of the rifle. This first guy, he ran across the street and stood on the corner where they was coming down. And as soon as they got, the whole town was on fire, and the light from the fires was give us pictures, but we stayed in the shadows, you know. We could see them coming. And as soon as they got to this corner, we hollered, a bunch of us hollered, halt. Of course, they just stopped, and they had all kinds of equipment, bazookas and sniper rifles and all that stuff. And we told them to put their hands on their head. And this one guy that ran across the street, he forgot to throw his safety on his rifle. Yeah, I think he had a carbine. And this one guy, as he walked around the corner, this one German was on a bicycle, and on the bicycle, front wheel between his legs. There they was. He had a burp gun on his handlebars. He had a carbine in his hand. They had their guns in each other's bellies. And he said, I never had such a long minute in my life. And said, finally, when the German knocked his burp gun off on the ground, he said, didn't waste any time getting my safety throat. He said, I couldn't have thrown it. He'd have heard that. He said, then he'd have probably pulled his triggers. I threw my safety. So anyway, we captured, well, there's about 29 in that group. We captured 3 groups on that corner that very night. Marched them to the command post. Of course, we'd rush back there. Before the next group would come along, we'd have to kick all that stuff up and pick it up and get it out of the street. We just threw it off in that canal. Next morning, we looked down, and there was sniper rifles, telescope sights, bazookas, and everything else.
My dad carried for about a week. He carried I don't know if it was a 98K with a sniper rifle with a scope on it, and he was given at one time the rifle. And they were not up at the front at this time, and this was basically a souvenir. There's no way for him to get it home, and they wouldn't let him send it home, you know. And
I carried my 3 pistols home in my barracks bag.
Did you?
You know, the very bottom of it.
They said also that, or my dad said that at one time they gave him an American rifle, a 30-06 with a scope on it, and he said that was one of the things that they passed around and no one would take it, because my dad said that if they were ever taken prisoner, the Germans wouldn't take. And it basically, likewise, if there was someone found someplace with a, you know, a scope, they were there for a purpose, and that was
right.
the snipe, you know.
Every one of us guys had a German pistol on our hip. We weren't issued. Some of the non-coms and officers all carried 45 Colts, automatics, you know. But us other guys had to confiscate what we carried. Of course, we had plenty of ammunition. But the captain told us, as you guys get captured with those, they'll stick that barrel in your mouth and pull the trigger on you. So we had to take our chances anyway, you know. Oh, that's the way they done each other.